distinguished professor is Professor Robert Williams. Is a professor of law emeritus at Rutgers University School of Law and is the director of the Center for State Constitutional Studies. He is also the author of American State Constitutions, written in 2009. He will speak on the topic, the power of states in relation to the federal government, federal-state government relations. At the end, distinguished Professor Galadios Araya, who is a professor of international and African studies at Lehman College, City University, and president of Institute of Development and Education for Africa, will make a closing remark. He is also executive member of the Solidarity of Nations and Nationalities. Thank you all. I hope we will have a nice time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Priest Dr. Bentin. Thank you. That's excellent. Next, we'll have, Professor Tigrai is not here today. He couldn't make it. So Professor Galadios Araya will speak in place of him. Professor Galadios, if you're ready.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, this is going to be, first and foremost, I like to really extend my gratitude to Professor Williams and Professor Kincaid. They are actually the distinguished professors, and they are the honored guests for Solidarity. I am a member of Solidarity, and most of you are members of Solidarity, but I want to thank them. But anyway, this assignment was given to me now. So I am familiar with the subject matter. I can do it impromptu. I'm not prepared, but it's okay. So what I'm going to do actually is I like to first begin with the idea, because I have written about this some time ago and presented to members of Solidarity as well. And then I've written about the federalist and unitary systems in comparative perspective. And one scholar I want to mention by way of introduction is our colleague. This, by the way, Professor Williams and Kincaid are my colleagues because I am professor myself. But one other colleague from in Chicago who written so many pieces on federalism is Michael Pagano. And he said once, I remember, the 21st century might be destined to be federalism secolo di oro, its gilded age, the finest hour. So 21st century is for federalism. And in defining what federalism is, it is almost always the result of careful deliberation, agreement and choice and compromise among constituent members. It differs from other forms of plural and multi-level governance in that it contains a strong commitment to balanced equality. Balanced equality, that's the central theme of federalism. And in its philosophical sense, furthermore, these scholars and myself agree that federalism can be understood as a way of approaching politics that acknowledge group identity alongside individual identity. However, it is a particular form of group identity that federalism acknowledges, a special, locational, or territorial one. This is very important. And above all, the federal system rests principally on the degree of autonomy that the constituent units enjoy within the political system. This is how we should understand what federalism is. And now what I want to do actually is try to compare and contrast the Ethiopian and some other federalisms. So the relationship and authority of states and the federal government are governed, in the case of the United States, by the Constitution. The federal government delegates certain enumerated powers, while all other powers not otherwise prohibited by the Constitution are reserved to the states. Incredibly, this was directly emulated by Ethiopia in its constitution. What I just read, what is not prohibited by the Constitution is reserved to the states, is Amendment 10 of the Constitution of the United States. In Ethiopia, it's Article 52, number 1, that says what is not for the federal government is reserved for the regional states. More or less the same, actually, really. But in the case of Ethiopia, the government was much more stronger and centralized as opposed to the regional states, which were operating at the behest or whim of the federal government. But compared to present regime, Abiy Ahmed, that literally eliminated the authority of the states, that of the EPRDF, the former government, was by far better in terms of respecting the regional states' powers that already enshrined in the Constitution and respected the relative autonomy of the 9 regional states. During the EPRDF, the regional states used to elect their presidents. Those are what we call governors in the United States or other countries. They were named as presidents in Ethiopia, governors of the regional states. Now, Abiy, in violation of the Constitution, appoints states presidents. And as a result, the balanced equality between federal government, the regional states is altogether eliminated. Many other federal systems, including that of the US I mentioned already, and Germany and Belgium, have created strong national governments anchored in the diversity of the constituent parts. Diversity is respected. That is the respect of the diversity of the various cultural groups and linguistic groups in Ethiopia. Additionally, in the US, we have the National Governors Association. This is actually unique when it comes to the United States. We have the National Governors Association that serves as checks and balances that also monitor the overall relationship between the federal government and the 50 states, as a matter of fact, in the United States. There was no such type of association in Ethiopia, although there were mayors' annual conferences where they were actually sharing experiences. And by and large, that's what I see. From other things I presented last time to my colleagues here in Solidarity, I mentioned actually several countries like Brazil, like India, like Germany, and like Belgium. They are all federalisms, but they can differ in some aspects. In Germany, for instance, even cities like Berlin are part of the federal structure. And then some civic organizations are also involved in the federal system, including some banks, by the way, in Germany. And Belgium used to be a unitary state, but upon considering the rights of the minority German population in Belgium, it converted itself to a federal system. And the whole idea of federalism is to bring the balanced equality I mentioned already, and human dignity, which is very important, recognition of the diverse cultures of the people that actually make up any nation state that we consider or see around the globe. In the United States, some of the United States are okay. Sweden, for instance, the United States, they have a fair system, but it's not going to be like the federal government or systems, because the federal system is deliberately designed to redress the problems that the minority people especially encounter. That's the advantage of a federal system. So this, by and large, I hope my two colleagues are going to say more than I do. But what I like to do now is add a little thing of the principles of the General Association I mentioned, General Governance Association I mentioned earlier. So the federal action should be limited to some situations in which the constituent authority for action is clear and certain. Federal action should be limited to problems that are truly national in scope. Federal action should be sensitive to each state's ability to bring a unique blend of resources and approaches to common problems. Unless the national interest is at risk, federal action should not preempt additional state action. And in the case of the United States, Congress should not interfere into the state's revenue systems. State standards should be preserved. The judicial branch should respect state authority. The 10th Amendment should be observed. States should be actively involved in cooperative effort to develop policy and administrative procedures. So it goes on and on and on. This could be actually observed universally in many federal states. So with this, I end the federal system analysis on my part. I was not prepared, I told you, impromptu, but it's okay. Now, I'd like to touch a little bit briefly for a couple of minutes on self-determination theory. Self-determination suggests that all humans have three basic psychological needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness that underlie growth and development. This is more of a psychological thing and applies to not only the nation state or the states and people of diverse cultures, but to even businesses, organizations as well. My interest of self-determination in the context of the many topics that we're going to do today actually denotes the legal right of people to decide their own destiny in the international order. Self-determination is a core principle of international law and enshrined in a number of international treaties, including the United Nations Charter, Article number 1. The principle was incorporated into the 1941 Atlantic Charter that evolved into the United Nations Charter. Okay? And most importantly, Woodrow Wilson also came up with the idea of self-determination of peoples based on respect for the principle of equal rights and fair equality of opportunity, and to have the right to freely choose their sovereignty and international political status with no interference. However, Wilson, ignored the self-determination of the African people and other dominated people in Asia and elsewhere. That was the problem. Otherwise, I really admire the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson as well. One other thing that I want to mention with respect to self-determination is the right of self-determination of people is recognized in many other international laws adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1970, the Helsinki Final Act adopted by the Conference in Security and Cooperation in Europe in 1975, the African Charter of Human and People's Rights of 1981, and then the again, the European Charter of Paris for a New Europe adopted in 1990, and the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action in 1993. It has been affirmed by the International Court of Justice in the Namibia case, the Western Sahara case, the East Timor case. You can go on and on and on and on. But to conclude, I want to mention some people actually don't even know this person I'm about to introduce you. His name is Aimé Césaire. He was a Pan-Africanist, a poet from a little island in the Caribbean by the name Martinique. He was fighting for the liberation of Black people and the independence of African countries as well from colonialism. So once, with respect to self-determination, he said, a political and social regime that destroys the self-determination of a people also destroys the creative power of that people. With this, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gladius. Excellent presentation. After this, we will have a question and answer session about for 10 minutes. Can you please mute yourself? Okay, thank you. So if any of you have a question, you can click reactions and you can click raise hand so that we can see who has questions. Anybody has question? Okay. I see Gide has a question. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, the panelists and the chairperson. I heard I don't have the name of from Somali. Can you give me what's your name?
Abdinur Abdullah.
The speaker from Somali and
Region, yeah.
Dr. Banti and Professor Galadios. Thank you so much for the presentation. So my question is, if you remember, after Dr. Abiy came to power, TPLF was campaigning for nations and nationalities to stand with the people of Tigray. And I think TPLF took that for granted, that it will get support of the nations and nationalities. But this never happened. In fact, after the war broke, the nations and nationalities stand in support with Mr. Abiy Ahmed to campaign against TPLF and implement his project of extermination of the people of Tigray. What happened here? Why? As you mentioned, the people, the nations and nationals were subject of subjugation, assimilation. They were not allowed to use their language, practice their culture during the old regime. And now, all of a sudden, they stood with the people who are campaigning for the unitary government. What went wrong on this? What happened to the nations and nationalities? And my second question is, during the APRDF time, the questions were fair distribution of wealth related to issues of maladministration and for more democratic rights. However, now the questions has become a question of safety and security. And people cannot go back home from office, from school, without fear of being arrested, killed, or what have you. So when you look things retrospectively, do you think that the change of the government was a bad idea? Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. If anybody else have a question, we can probably combine, and Dr. Gladius can answer together. Otherwise, Dr. Gladius, if you could just answer the question.
Yeah,
please.
I can, Mr. Goodade's concern and question, I have understood it perfectly. The problem is when the TPLF went back to Tigray, it was too late to talk about nation and nationalities. That was when the TPLF was weaker. When the TPLF, along with the APRDF, was strong, when it was exercising power in Addis Ababa. And then, of course, I give credit to the APRDF for coming up with the idea of federalism and the idea of regional states. It happened for the first time in the history of Ethiopia. However, like I mentioned earlier, the central government was stronger than the regional states. The regional states were really operating at the whim and behest of the central government. So already when EPRDF was in Addis Ababa, the powers of the regional states, the nationalities and nations was weakened. By the time the TPLF was ejected and went back to Mekelle, Tigray, and Abiy Ahmed emerged with a group of people who were granting revenge against the federalism, against the nationalities, who were on behalf of the unitary state. So they've used every avenue to eliminate what the EPRDF did earlier in the federal structure. So there's nothing you can do. It was too late. By the time, I remember very well, they had conferences in Mekelle. By the way, but it was too late. By then, Abiy and his cronies were organizing themselves at a fast rate. Very fast.
Thank you.
They've done it. That's why they managed to mobilize the people, and the people were not conscious enough. There was no consciousness, lack of consciousness, lack of knowledge of history, everything. So it doesn't matter whether they had a federal structure or not. Abiy could easily mobilize those people against Tigray. They've done it. So that's the main problem.
And shall I add a little bit the first answer? If you finish it, Doctor. Sorry.
Go ahead, Abdunur.
Yes, actually, thanks, Doctor. You answered it, actually. And thank you very much. I appreciate it. And if I took, like, for example, in Somali region, and the people and the government of the region was different completely. And the Somali region, as a people, we are organized. And you know, when they took the Somali regional police, new police to the border between Tigray and Alamata and that area, actually we mobilized the social media and we mobilized it everywhere. And at the end, we succeed to bring back our Somali regional forces to the Somali region without fighting without doing and participating in the fights in Tigray region. And that was a really, still we appreciate, and because how we are mobilized and how our people are stand to not fight, our regional forces don't fight in Tigray people and Tigray government. And at the end, they said, actually, we are suspicious. Maybe the Somali regional forces, they joined to TPLF, and that's why they brought back to Jijiga. So that's what happened, and that's really one of the things and one of the good things that we did in as a mobilizing Somali regional forces. And Somali people took that role, and the government of Somali region, they are not happy that mobilizing, and they accuse us we are explorers as a diaspora, and they name it, even one of the names, and one including my name, and one of those are explorers. So I think all the regions, they are not same. Some of the regions, they participate. There are forces and they are contributions and everything. But in Somali region, the good thing we are mobilized and we are succeeded was to bring back our Somali regional forces to not participation the kills and that war in Tigray region, and that's good for us. We are not, our hand is not blood and in Tigray genocide.
Dr. Mabit, I will add just 1 or 2 minutes also to the answers.
We have 1 more minute, please.
Okay. I agree with Dr. Galadios, what he said. Yes, there was a week, it was too late at the time TPLF was pushed, and that's true. But the problem is the nations and nationalities were already not cooperating among themselves during EPRDF itself. If I speak for Oromia, Oromia has been always the area of war, and we, the Oromos, did not get support from other nations. It continued, you remember 2015, 16, up to why it came to this position. Individual rights were violated, collective rights were violated in Oromia. And the worst is OPD Oromia has never elected OPDO as their party. It was a given party. That is where the failure is, if we openly speak with each other. So OPDO has never and is never party of the Oromo people trusted. That's one thing. And 2018, when Dr. Abiy came, the whole Walaga was under command post before Tigray war. And other nations and nationalities just looked when Abiy was killing the Oromos in Walaga, Guji, and Wallo. So what my appeal is that the past is the past. What about the future? The future is, the solution is that nations and nationalities who believe in self-determination should cooperate and work together to bring sustainable peace, not only in Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa region. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker will be distinguished Professor John Kincaid. Professor John Kincaid, if you're ready.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to speak to this distinguished audience today. And I'd also like to thank the speakers who preceded me for their kind comments. I regret the terrible conflict and death that's occurring in Ethiopia, and I certainly hope this organization can help to solve that problem and bring peace and unity to the people of Ethiopia, while also respecting the diversity of the various communities in the country. I visited Ethiopia only once, but I hope to return to your wonderful country someday in the future. So I'm looking forward to that, and also to learning more about Ethiopia from the discussions at this conference. So thank you again for your invitation. I was asked to speak about political parties and federal systems. This is a very complex subject to discuss in a few minutes. I'll seek to make some general points with the hope that we can refine and elaborate on those points during discussion. So feel free to bring up questions or comments during the discussion period after the presentation. I don't want to dwell on the United States at length because it is a somewhat unusual system. Modern political parties were invented in the United States, and its Democratic Party is the oldest continuing political party in the world. Yet, interestingly, the framers of the U.S. Constitution detested parties, and the federal Constitution says nothing about political parties. So instead, the parties developed as informal coalitions of state-based groups seeking to win presidential elections. And the first party contested election was the presidential election of 1800, which also marked the first peaceful democratic transfer of power from one party to another in history. So the U.S. two-party system was fully institutionalized by 1828. Many federal systems, of course, have multi-party systems, explaining why the United States has only a two-party system would be too long to undertake here, but nonetheless, we have functioned as primarily a two-party system throughout our history. So the Democratic and Republican parties are confederations of state party organizations that come together every 4 years to try to capture the White House. However, in conjunction with greater centralization of the American federal system during the past 50 years, each political party has become more vertically integrated and somewhat hierarchical as a result. But the parties are still regulated primarily by the states and only very secondarily by the federal government. Each state has its own laws governing its Democratic, Republican, and other parties. So while there's vigorous party competition for Congress and the presidency, what we've seen in the United States is a decline in party competition in most of the states in recent decades. Consequently, today, Republicans control the governorship in both houses of the legislature in 22 states, while Democrats control the governorship in both houses of the legislature in 17 states. So we only have 11 of the 50 states at the moment that have divided party control. So today, 41.5% of the world's people live under a federal constitution of some sort, although not all of them work well or are democratic. The health of a federal system is due significantly to its party system. Overall, political parties usually play a determinative role in the operation and balance of power in federal systems, as well as in the extent to which a federal system operates democratically, protects human rights, and distributes resources equitably among all regions. So political parties are one of the most important forces shaping the extent to which a federal system is centralized or non-centralized, because in controlling the levers of government, parties oversee the implementation of the Constitution, the enactment of laws, the execution of policies, the staffing of political and bureaucratic institutions, and often the staffing of the judiciary. Consequently, the courts may or may not be independent as a result of that party control. So centralization in federal systems is usually associated with integrated party politics that emphasize national unity and ideologies that cross-cut territorial cleavages and also control by the same party of both the national and the constituent governments. Parties also distribute benefits to various constituencies in ways that strengthen or weaken federalism as a system of self-rule and shared rule. That's an important, I think, pithy definition of federalism, a system of self-rule and shared rule. And so, for example, the party that controls the national government might send resources to constituent governments that support the national party and deny resources to constituent governments that oppose the national political party. So these party dynamics between parties in the regions and parties in the national government are very important to the functioning or malfunctioning, as the case may be, of a federal system. So as such, parties can be seen as independent variables influencing the operation of federal systems. And party ideology is also very important. That is, do parties emphasize national unity while respecting regional diversity, or do they seek to suppress regional diversity in order to foster more unity? Do parties emphasize regional diversity and autonomy more than national unity? So paying attention to the ideological orientation of parties in addition to their structure, and both tend usually to go together, is very important in looking at a the party system and federal arrangements. However, parties also can be seen to some extent as dependent variables. All right, different types of federal systems may motivate or virtually mandate parties to develop vertical linkages between constituent governments and the national government, linkages between constituent governments and the national government, and linkages between constituent governments themselves, or dualistic structures characterized more by the independence of the constituent political party organizations and their national party organizations. In federal systems, party organization and competition occur within a territorially complex system that involves multiple and interconnected territorial jurisdictions and orders of government. Consequently, parties play important roles in integrating or disintegrating these multiple arenas of power and competition. This also places a premium on lawmaking with respect to governing elections, governing political parties, governing financial affairs of political parties, and ensuring or trying to ensure through the rule of law the adequate democratic competition among political parties in all of the arenas of a federal system. So it makes it a much more complex arrangement than we find in unitary political systems, where you have more of a single party system operating nationwide as opposed to the multiple jurisdictions that we see in federal arrangements. Now, this also makes it more exciting. It makes it more interesting, and increases the possibilities of democracy if the party system can function well in a federal arrangement, because it opens doors to a lot of participation by citizens, much more opportunities for office holding by people. And in those respects, a federal system offers the possibility of a richer, more dynamic democratic system than one would find in a single unitary arrangement. And those, I think, are kind of important parts of thinking about. So the parties are very important, and as well, the need to have an adequate rule of law that ensures democratic competition. Now, federal systems that are organized around territorially defined religious, linguistic, and or nationality lines may, of course, encourage the formation of chauvinistic regional parties, each pursuing self-interested sub-nationalist objectives without regard for vertical or horizontal cooperation and unity. These systems also tend to incentivize the creation of separatist and secessionist political parties. So in effect, just as we talk about the balance of power in federal arrangements between the national government and regional or constituent governments, we also have to think of the same dynamics in the party system, and an appropriate balance of power in the party system between the national and regional governments, and an adequate commitment on the part of the parties and regional governments to some form of national unity, while nevertheless still protecting the diversity of the regional communities. Now, at the same time, these types of systems can give rise to a hegemonic party that is a broad coalition able to dominate the national government and many constituent or regional governments, or to a more narrowly constituted hegemonic party dominated by a single religious, linguistic, or nationality group. So these are some of the dangers in party arrangements that can arise from that type of federal system. More generally, thinking of parties as independent and dependent variables, there's usually a two-way kind of mutual interaction between the parties and their federal system. although the more hegemonic the national party, the more the interaction will be one way, namely party control of the federal system's operation. In the case of hegemonic parties, no aspect of the federal system is free from party dictates, including usually intergovernmental relations, which are managed more by party functionaries than by civil service bureaucrats. In developed federal democracies, there is ordinarily a separation between party-driven policymaking among the elected legislative and executive officials and the bureaucratically driven implementation of policies in the intergovernmental administrative system, so that the intergovernmental relations are ordinarily governed by civil service rules, while policymaking in the intergovernmental system will, of course, be more driven by the policy preferences of the political parties that control those institutions. Another important question is the extent to which parties mobilize voters to participate in local, regional, and national elections, or to the extent to which parties limit their mobilization to only one or two of those electoral arenas. And again, the structure of the party system is going to make a difference here in voter mobilization. At the same time, there may be extensive interference in elections, especially by a hegemonic national party seeking to influence the outcomes of local or regional elections. So for national parties seeking to maintain control, the outcome of those elections is very important to their maintenance of that control system. In turn, a strong and sizable subnational regional party may seek to manipulate the outcome of a national election. So that possibility exists as well. Another important issue is the extent to which interest groups, civil society organizations, and non-governmental organizations can compete with parties to influence policymaking and policy implementation. And here I think we can make a rough generalization, and that is to say that given the importance of parties in federal systems, we also need to be attentive to the equal and competing importance of civil society organizations, non-governmental organizations. These institutions also need to flourish, in part as a check on a party system becoming too ossified or too controlling, too hierarchical, too hegemonic. And so in constructing a federal political system, in addition to the party system, I think we also need to be attentive to how robust these civil society organizations are as well, in being both competing with and compatible with the political party system that's operating in the federal country. So although we can make some rough generalizations about parties and federalism across federations, in the final analysis, each federal system and its party arrangement is unique. And unfortunately, there's no one best model of federalism and parties. Different arrangements work for different federal systems. And so the people of any given country might draw some useful lessons from other countries, but it is most necessary to consider the probable costs and benefits particular party structures in relation to the particular federal structure of that country. And so one cannot simply copy another model, just draw lessons from different models and trying to accommodate that to the federal arrangement of any particular country, because again, there's no one ideal or best way of doing this. So I'll end on that note and thank you for your attention. And I look forward to a lively discussion.
Thank you very much. It was excellent. Thank you. It was really educational. We have a few questions on the chat and I can read it. One question is from Alam Tasfai. She's saying, why Tigray nationalist Tigrayans are wrongly understood as separatists, and we're not. We're just Tigrayans in nationalism. We're undergoing genocide, cruelty approved by the US and the rest of European society. So she wants to know why they are considered as separatists.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand the question.
She wants to know why nationalist Tigrayan, the Tigray people, are considered as separatists, but they're not. They're just facing genocidal war and cruelty as approved by US and the rest of European countries. So she's trying to say that they are misunderstood as separatists, where they're just facing this genocidal war. Maybe, Alam, if you can clarify.
Of course. May I enter?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Sorry, gentleman who has been talking, I understood you like American one. Isn't he?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, I want to make clear. Simple, short, and concise. I see many of you. I am familiar with many of you here. And do not forget that we are not foolish. We are not foolish. You have to understand that we Tigrayans have been undergoing genocide. Genocide in its fullest meaning. And you have all the data. You have all the satellites, pictures, everything. The drone attack. 1 million Tigrayans perished in less than 2 years. So let's not talk like as if we don't understand what has been going on in Tigray. I know the issue now is reconciliation, making peace with Ethiopia, and so on and so on. How can you make peace with Ethiopia, or for that matter, with America and with all imperialists who allowed Tigrayans to perish? Drone attacks are made by many other countries like Iran, like all the Arabs country. That would not happen without approval of the Americans. We know that. Okay. So you are God in the earth and there is God in the heaven. Okay. I do not accept that. Please do not play such kind of false role that you are making peace with Ethiopia. We have undergone such a genocidal act. Our 120,000 women are gang raped. Can you address that, please? No peace without justice. Justice is needed to make a peace. Justice, responsibility. Responsibility taken by the genociders, including America. Please stop. Okay, I can't stop. But the discussion will go on and go on and on. Okay, you can't pursue on pretending. You are pretending to be peace with Ethiopia.
Dr. Mabet, do something, okay?
Okay. I'm sorry, guys. 1 second. Thank you, Gus. Thank you.
Okay, you want to close me, Claudius, please.
Come on, please.
You can continue.
Thank you, Alam. We have to have this question very concise to the point. Our guests are coming in to give their
Your
perspective.
guests are Americans. Okay, go ahead.
If you're gonna keep talking, I don't think that's appropriate. Please let me talk, and then I'll give you the chance. But the questions has to be very precise and to the point. And the guests are here today to give us their perspective on what ethnic
It
federalism
was concise and in the point.
Alam, I'm sorry, but if you're not conducting yourself accordingly, you have to be removed. So we're respectful. We're here to discuss. I know there's emotions running, but for the sake of time and space, let's let them answer you. I think they got your point. So let them answer if the question is understood already. Thank you.
Who is going to answer the questions?
Go ahead, Dr. Gilad. Got her point.
Excuse me. The thing is, something is out of order now. Who's talking? See, so many people are talking in between. Eden, are you now hosting the thing? Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Gilad.
Okay. What I'm saying is this. Number one, the topics that we're going to address today by the two distinguished professors has to do with federalism, relationship of federalism to the states, blah, blah, blah. We've done about genocide in Tigray 100 times myself. But the platform is different. That's why Professor Kincaid could not understand, for instance, when the question was forwarded to him, why were the Tigrayans called separatists? He could not understand it because he could not relate it to his own presentation. They called them secessionists for sure, in order to subdue Tigray, not just the TPLF, but subdue Tigray. And the objective was to eliminate the people of Tigray. But that's not now directly relevant to the topics we're talking about. So some questions have to be relevant. You have to control it to Eden. It's your responsibility, and Dr. Mabet as well. So if there are other questions, please entertain those questions.
Okay, so we're taking question related to the federalism and the role of political parties in the federal system. So I have another question. I'm going to read from chat from Avera Paulus. So he's saying, could you please elaborate on pros and cons of political parties formed by ethnic lines rather than political ideologies?
Okay, so my presentation was neither supporting nor opposing separatist parties, but trying to allude briefly to the circumstances under which those parties arise. So it's quite natural, again, in a federal system that is organized along ethnic or nationality lines, there is more likely to be the development of regional parties that are ethnically or nationality based or linguistically based. And that does make the achievement of national unity more difficult and puts a greater burden on the federal government to provide the conditions under which those regions would feel comfortable being part of, the federation as a whole. And so it's a two-way street here, in which there has to be some, as in a federal system itself, there has to be some balance, some give and take. And a lot of this depends on the willingness of the national government to be accommodating up to a certain point of the diversity of the constituent regions that exist in the country. So, you contrast that with the United States. We have not really had any regional parties in the United States because we don't have territorially distinct ethnic or nationality communities. Mm-hmm. And so those parties have not emerged in our system, but they will emerge in systems that are organized along nationality lines. That's to be expected.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Mavit, do you have other questions or I?
Yes, I have. There's Khalid.
Okay, after that, I'm going to go.
Okay. Khalid, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mavit. Thank you, Dr. If I pronounce it wrong, correct me, Professor Kincaid, right?
Kincaid, that was very close.
Kincaid, all right, Dr. Kincaid. How are you today?
I'm great, thank you.
Thank you for being here. My question is relating to political parties on the federal system. Is there any experience parties vis-a-vis religious institutions? Why I'm asking this is, at present time, the Prosperity Party is creating a big crisis within the Orthodox faith. So I want to understand what is the relation between political parties vis-a-vis religious institutions. I understand the state should be secular, but can a political party say that the issue of politics doesn't concern me? Thank you very much. If I am clear.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think that, whenever you mix a political party with religion, you run the risk of both damaging the religion and damaging the country in terms of trying to impose some uniformity on the country as a whole. And now in the more developed democracies, you think of Germany, which historically has had sort of Catholic and Protestant parties. The religious element has declined in importance. They represent somewhat different points of view, but there's not no longer a strong association. But if you think of the Prime Minister Modi's party in India pushing a very strong Hindu line, one can see the consequences of that type of party system. So generally speaking, it seems to me, in my view, the more one can separate the parties from religion or downplay the role of religion, the healthier that will be for a federal system, because in any multi-religious society like India or Germany, trying to impose any kind of single religious view is certainly a problem, and may also create problems for the religion itself, since not everyone who is an adherent to that religion may necessarily agree with how the political party interprets that religion.
Thank you very much. I think we are out of time for question and answer. Thank you, Professor John Kincaid. That was excellent presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So our next speaker will be distinguished Professor Robert F. Williams. Professor Robert, go ahead, please.
Williams.
Thank you very much. I want to join Dr. Kincaid. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I want to join Dr. Kincaid in thanking the organizers for putting this important conference together. And I think we can already tell how important this is to the people of Ethiopia. And I join him as well as in the hope that these problems that are taking place there can be resolved, and that peace will return to the country of Ethiopia. I was going to give a sort of an outline of the American arrangement of power and authority between the national government, the federal government, and the state governments. And I want to start with the origin of our constitutional structure. We have a much shorter history than most federations, just somewhat over 200 years. But to some extent, we believe that the origin of a federal system will affect the division of power between the national government and the states. And by this, I mean, if like the origin of the United States, in the United States, the federation was created by would become states, the 13 colonies came together. So we call it a sort of a coming together federation, by contrast to a unitary country that decides to devolve power to component units or states. And we think this is important because, as my colleague Alan Tarr pointed out, that when the component units of a federation come together and create a national government, they're most likely to retain more power and authority or competence to deal with matters than if a unitary country is devolving power to component units. It's likely to devolve less power. And so we think it's very important to look at the process of originating the federation, to understand why either more or less power would be in the hands of the states in comparison to the federal government. So that's the first point, and we see that in our country, which was a coming together federation, the states have quite a bit of power, and it's reflected in the national Constitution. The U.S. Constitution gives power or enumerates powers to the national government. Famous examples are to regulate interstate commerce between the states, among the states, the power to provide for a national defense, those things. There's a list of powers in the national Constitution, followed by what we call the necessary and proper clause, which kind of says, well, these powers are enumerated, and the federal government can also exercise powers that are sort of necessary for them to carry out those powers. But that's it. So the federal government has actually limited its authority is limited to certain areas that are defined in the Constitution, and then, of course, have been interpreted by our United States Supreme Court over the years. So determinations about what is necessary and proper, determinations about whether the federal government is really regulating interstate commerce, those kinds of questions are decided authoritatively by our United States Supreme Court. By contrast, and in the U.S., I think our colleague mentioned the 10th Amendment to our U.S. Constitution, basically saying everything that wasn't given up to the federal government, everything that wasn't delegated to the federal government, is retained by the states and by the people of the states. So consequently, the constitutions of the states do not have to enumerate power. Everything that wasn't given to the federal government at our origin was retained by the states and the people of the states. So there's no need for a state constitution to enumerate power. You don't look at a state constitution in the United States to see if the state government can enact a landlord-tenant law or a corporation's law, a criminal law. That's within the power that was retained by the states at the time we formed our national government. So the function of the state constitutions is really quite different from the national constitution. They're not just little versions, little replicas of the federal constitution, but they actually have quite a different political and legal function. And so I'm overstating this, oversimplifying it, but the main function of state constitutions is to limit this power that was retained at the time we formed our federal government. So you'll find things in state constitutions that say certain things cannot be taxed, and taxation has to be imposed in a certain way and not in any other way. All sorts of details about government in the 50 state constitutions that then that otherwise limit from the point of view of the state's constitution this reserved power, we call it plenary power, that the states have, which would otherwise be extremely broad. So the history of state constitutions, together with protecting rights in ways that I'll talk about in a minute, is a process not of granting powers, but of putting limitations on these very wide plenary powers that the states have. And I think this sounds like what our colleague said was your Article 51 in Ethiopian Constitution, that everything that wasn't enumerated was retained by the component units in the states. And then, of course, we have the supremacy clause in our national constitution that interestingly makes even the lowest form of federal law, for example, federal administrative regulations. We have as well some federal common law, judge-made law, not a lot anymore, but some, and certainly federal laws, and for sure the United States Constitution. All of those are the supreme law of our country. Anything, and it's even in the text of the supremacy clause, anything in the constitutions to the contrary notwithstanding, the constitutions of the states to the contrary notwithstanding. So the drafters of the federal constitution took care to make sure that any kind of federal law would take precedence over even the highest form of state law. Now, this has to be qualified by the point that federal law has to be valid, and that's up to the U.S. Supreme Court. So you could have a situation where the U.S. Congress passes a law and says, we're regulating interstate commerce. And if the United States Supreme Court thinks you're not really regulating interstate commerce, that's not valid under our Constitution, that kind of a law would not take precedence over state law. It happened. We had an example of this with the so-called Obamacare, the Affordable Health Care Act, pretty famous in our country. So the United States Supreme Court decides conflicts between the states and the federal government on exercise of authority, and actually, so that can change over time. Our U.S. Constitution is virtually impossible to amend. I think it's well known. It's 27 amendments, John, over the years, and it's just not feasible. It's just too complicated amend our federal constitution. So these arrangements are pretty frozen into the national constitution. So changes in the relationship of states to the federal government is pretty much left to the Supreme Court as it interprets these relationships in the national constitution. State constitutions are much easier to amend. They're not easy, but they're a lot easier than the United States Constitution, and the states have had thousands of amendments. And so the state's power and the way it's exercised actually can be changed both by textual amendment to the state constitution and by decisions of the state Supreme Courts. So the way that state authority is exercised and is fairly changeable in our country. Sort of interesting. Now, a little bit more detail here. The U.S. Congress is allowed to and quite regularly shares some of its power, let's again say, to regulate interstate commerce with the states. So we have many examples of cooperative federalism where a power that would be ordinarily reserved to the national government, with the consent of the national government, is shared with the states in various ways. And often this is through federal funds being given to the states to carry out certain federal functions. And even that is subject to some review by the United States Supreme Court. Interestingly, the states can push back on exercises of federal authority or federal power. And they do that in a variety of ways. One of them, I think, is common to all federations, that they can exercise or seek to exercise political power in the national capital when exercises of federal power are being debated. The states send representatives, lobbyists. This is partially a function of political parties too, as Dr. Kincaid was explaining. So the states are not politically powerless in the face of potential federal lawmaking or even making of administrative regulations. The states they have equal representation in the Senate. So even the smallest state in our Senate has 2 senators, and the largest state only has 2 senators. So there's a potential for a political influence in that way. But also it's interesting that the states, this is quite an important phenomenon in the last 30 or 40 years here. The states are able to provide more rights protections for their citizens than are available under the United States Constitution as interpreted by the United States Supreme Court. So states, let's say the United States Supreme Court has interpreted the famous American Bill of Rights to grant certain rights, say to free speech or against law enforcement searches and seizures and things like that. The states can provide more rights, and they don't have to do it through their constitution. The states can provide more rights than the federal constitution provides by ordinary law or even by judge-made common law at the state level. So some people view this as a way of challenging the national government by saying, for states to say, well, we're going to have more free speech in our state than is required in our country as a whole. Very interesting and important phenomenon. And it does go on in some other federations, but it's not as prominent as it is in the United States. No secession. Our Supreme Court has said there's no possibility, sort of a product of our Civil War, no possibility for a state to secede from the Union. So if I remember, that's a fairly big difference from the situation in Ethiopia. I mentioned that the states have equal representation in the Senate. There's some opinion in America that should be changed, but it's really quite unlikely that it'll happen anytime soon. Finally, we have in our federal constitution the authority for Congress, our federal legislative branch, to admit new states. So there are discussions here about statehood for Puerto Rico, possibly Guam, some of these U.S. territories. So that's an authority that is exclusive to the U.S. Congress. A state couldn't, on its own, decide to join the American Federation. So that's an outline, I think, of the relationship of state governmental authority to the governmental authority of the national government, federal government here. And we, unlike a number of federations, we don't utilize a list or a catalog of competencies. We do it in the U.S. Constitution for those enumerated federal powers, but the national government does not include a catalog or a list of state powers because of the essentially the 10th Amendment, or your Article 51, that says, well, if it's not enumerated in the national constitution, it's left to the states and their people. So that's a kind of a shorthand description of our system, and I'm open to questions or discussion, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much. That's very, very well educational. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Next, distinguished Professor Gladius Aria will have a closing remark.
Don't you take questions, Dr. Mabit, for Professor Williams?
Questions, yeah.
We may have time for one question. We're running out of time.
Dr. Mabit, there is a question in the box in the chat, and it's
I was raising my hand.
Oh yeah, Danny, go ahead. You're first, and go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. I really thank the professor who just elaborated about the American Constitution and the nature of this geographic federation. My question is, as to Ethiopia, Ethiopia emerged from a feudal society. And the bureaucracy, the history of the bureaucracy is different. And after the emergence of federation in Ethiopia, before the change in bureaucratic structure, and this federation, the Mallas, I can call it Mallas Federation, was built on actually a unitary government prior to Mallas. So the problem started right there. Okay. Now, it's really hard for us to compare and contrast the American federal system with ethnic-based Ethiopian federal system. Is it safe to say it is very hard to create a federal system in a completely diversified society like Ethiopia, whereby some nationalities have upper hands in owning all the resources, bureaucracies, and highly educated groups? Is it safe to say it is impossible to create federalism in that situation? One. Secondly, is it correct to say start with confederation and go back to federalism rather than getting into this kind of confusion and creating one hegemonic party who can dominate the rest and eventually leads to the collapse of federalism? Can you answer this?
Thank you for those questions. I believe that what you're talking about in the first question is the problem of the ethnic and linguistic basis of Ethiopian federalism, which leads to minority. As I understand the Ethiopian states, they're not exclusively inhabited by people of one ethnic group or linguistic groups. In other words, they're minority people of a minority ethnic or linguistic traditions living in the states that are dominated by a different ethnic or linguistic group. And I've seen writings about the problem of minority rights in Ethiopian states. I don't have a great solution to that. I would not say it's impossible. I'm trying to think how many years Ethiopian federalism was handled peacefully before these problems have cropped up in the last few years. So I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it has a special set of problems compared to, say, a country like the United States that doesn't have these concentrations of ethnic or linguistic populations. The system in Ethiopia is going to have a separate set of problems, particularly including minority
okay.
territories.
Thank you, Professor Williams. There's a question in the chat. This question says, anti-federalists in Ethiopia argue that federalism is a threat to existence of Ethiopia. Were there a similar view in US? If there was, what strategy did the federalist forces use to overcome this? And let's see, do you have any suggestion to Ethiopian federalists to create a functional and sustainable federal system?
Wow, in 1 minute?
Maybe the first two.
Well, people do say that federalism has the potential seeds of its own destruction. Our experience in the United States, of course, was with a very, very brutal civil war over the possibility of the federation coming apart. And of course, the mechanism to avoid that was military force and a outcome of the war that led to the idea that no state could secede from the Union. The key, I think, and I don't have any great wisdom for Ethiopia, I'm sorry, but is the idea of power sharing that is a way of accommodating the aspirations of these different groups. And from what I could see, and I haven't studied the Ethiopian situation, but I've read some about it, you don't have a Supreme Court, but you have a different kind of decision-making body about conflicts and things. And I don't know if that's been allowed to work very much, but I'm sorry, I don't have any great recipe for. The one thing is, if I remember, the Ethiopian constitution permits secession of states, which is an interesting. I think I have that right. An interesting element of a federal system, but I'm not sure of the background for that provision. So I'm sorry, I'm just not going to have a solution.
Yes, no problem. It's a different situation. So if anyone has one more question, and after that we'll close.
Dr. Mabet, you have to also consider ideas, not just questions. I was going to add up to what Professor Williams said now.
Please.
Okay,
I can do it in a minute, actually.
Okay, go ahead.
What happened in the United States experience itself with respect to secession was first attempted by South Carolina, and then many other states followed, like Mississippi, Texas, and others. And then Texas actually was 1861, I guess, but it tried to form its own state, its own independent country. It was not allowed. Federal troops, they met the federal troops, that was the end of it. And the United States is defined. It's not just a federal system. Indivisible whole, period. No state can secede from the indivisible whole. Same thing happened in Brazil too, indivisible whole. In the case of Ethiopia, as Professor Williams aptly put it, there is a Article 39 that permits states to secede. But there are preconditions to that. People don't read carefully. It says it has to be supported by the seceding population, 2/3 of them if they vote, if they are in favor of it. And then it has to be studied by the federal government for at least 3 years. You can't simply secede just like that. And the problem with the Ethiopian secession clause is it was directly taken from Stalin, completely different scenario actually that they had in the Soviet Union. But what Stalin said actually is the secession ultimately will help a higher union, not just to secede, go separate ways, but to establish a higher union. There are so many misunderstandings in there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much. We're running out of time. I think Professor Galadius, if you can do a closing remark.
Well, first and foremost, of course, I'm going to thank our wonderful professors whom I said earlier, you remember they are my colleagues in the academia. Of course, I don't know these two professors, but they are really great. They've come with a wonderful presentation, and we've learned a lot from both of them, Professor Kincaid and Professor Williams, and especially the book that The Law of American State Constitutions I did not read it. I want to read it actually, really. And what we've done today was really very successful. I'm very gratified that the two professors joined us today. But overall, we have understood the principles of state-federal relations, what federalism is, the consequences sometimes they could have. In most instances, federalism actually outcome is positive, but it could have negative consequences like the Ethiopian experience. We've seen it ourselves. But believe it or not, my debut book that was published in 1995, the title is Ethiopia, the Political Economy of Transition. It was published by the University Press of America. In that book, I said the fact that the EPRDF came up with the idea of federalism, restructuring Ethiopia, giving a chance to the nationalities and nations, especially in terms of speaking their language and then flourishing their own cultures that was suppressed by the unitary state of Haile Selassie and others. It was a good idea, I said. I supported it. But I said, however, the political consciousness of Ethiopians is not that great. We have to admit that. The lack of knowledge of history as well of Ethiopians. Ethiopians have so many qualities. However, were they ready for the formation of a nationality based on ethnicity and language? I said in that book, it might have a negative impact. It might create nationality consciousness only, and then forget the pan-Ethiopian, the overarching national identity. And that's exactly what happened. The last 30 years, actually, people evolved their own local nationality only. Tigray, Oromo, Afar, and all those things, which is a good thing. I support it myself. I'm in solidarity. I'm on behalf of self-determination for these nationalities. However, we want to isolate ourselves from the Ethiopia thing. I myself am a Pan-Africanist. I am beyond Ethiopia, as a matter of fact. I come from Tigray, and I advocate on behalf of Tigray. However, I really have to make sure that I don't lose the overarching identity, which is important. We could not do this. That's why we're killing each other now in Ethiopia. That's why all these people, without even any knowledge of what's going on, they were involved in the massacre of the Tigrayan people. Genocide took place in there. So that's the consequence of the federal system, actually, because there were so many loopholes in there. You know, these federal systems in the Western Hemisphere that we have to learn a lot from them is the advent of capitalism itself and democracy. We don't have it. We emerged from a feudal, pre-capitalist things, maybe some, but it's predominantly feudal until the fall of Emperor Haile Selassie. So we had no basis of democratic political culture and a market economy. Both of them were missing links in the Ethiopian experience. So we have to learn a lot. We have to learn from these professors that came today. We have to read books. We have to elevate the consciousness of the Ethiopian people. If we want to come back again and then entertain an all Ethiopia thing, but primarily giving respect and rights to the nation and nationalities, of course. So what I want to see now, personally, is as a member of society, Solidarity of Nations, I want to see a new, completely restructured Ethiopia that actually gives greater autonomy to the various nationalities and nations in Ethiopia. That's the only way we can guarantee our togetherness. But the federal system that was attempted, that was tried in Ethiopia, was okay, but it created only 9 regional states. Now I want to see now like at least 20 of them, because there are many, many others that are actually demanding to become a regional state too, like Walaita, for instance, like so many of them in the southern part of Ethiopia. If we can do that, then we're going to overcome the negative experience that we have gone in the last 4 years since the coming of Abiy Ahmed. And then the war is going to be between the unitary ideologues of Abiy Ahmed and the ex-Derg former military government, and then the chauvinist elements that want to see a unitary state of the former Emperor Haile Selassie type, one unified in Addis Ababa and crushing all cultures and languages. That's not going to happen. It will never happen again. But the nationalities and nations also should be extremely careful, because there's so many division among Ethiopians now. Even if the nationalities are theoretically entertaining some ideas of working together, it's not happening. So many problems that we've encountered in the last 4 years. So we have to overcome so many things now. So with that in mind, what I want to say is solidarity itself, our solidarity, should at least come up with some ideas that can elevate the consciousness of Ethiopians, and then help the United Front as well, which is weak now. When United Front was established a couple of years ago in Washington, D.C., that they are not operating as unified military movement that can do something to the central government. And then one other thing came also that we have to consider. Now the Pretoria Accord, the one that was formidable, that can challenge the Abiy government, was the TPLF. But now that's going to be compromised to some extent, because they've agreed to settle their differences peacefully. So what's going to happen to the other United Front, Oromia, for instance? Oromia is still fighting. What's going to happen to the other ones, like Afar, like Somali, like Gambela, like Benishangul, like Amant, like Agro? What's going to happen? We have to consider this seriously as well. That's what I want to say, and thank you so much, all of you, for participating today on behalf of Solidarity of Nations of Ethiopia. Thank you, Professor Williams. Thank you, Professor Kincaid.
Thank you,
Dr. Mabet, as well. And thank you, all of you, okay?
Thank you.
Yeah, I want, Dr. Mabet, if you just give me 2 minutes.
Go ahead, please, go ahead.
Yes, I want to thank Professor John Kincaid and Professor Robert Williams on behalf of Solidarity. As you might have understood us, Solidarity is unique association. You might have heard of Ethiopian associations. When you go inside, you will find only one ethnic group. But in Solidarity, it's different. All ethnic groups are represented in Solidarity. So we are trying to work together for our future. So when I ask both of you to come and deliberate your speech, you welcomed me without any hesitation. I am really grateful for that. Professor John Kincaid has done that maybe 2-3 years before. We are grateful to him too. And we know one thing, United States and Ethiopia, they have very huge difference in economy, in culture, in democracy, in many things. We are very far apart. Ethiopia is one of the poorest countries, and United States is one of the wealthiest countries. And when we get this experience, like what Professor Williams said, we're not, like what Professor John Kincaid said, we're not going to copy it. We will learn from it, and we will see how to implement it in Ethiopia in the situation that permits our condition. So I want to thank you. I hope we'll be working together. We need more of your experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all attendees. Thank you for all our distinguished guest speakers. Thank you for, sorry, for those of you who are not able to ask questions, please email us at solidarityofnations@gmail.com. If you have any question, and we can answer it to you offline. Thank you so much.
But members of the solidarities will remain after the meeting.
Okay. Thank you so much. You have a nice day.
سلام زغوركم تخاتلتي تግራይ ኦንላይን ከመለኹም እዚ መደብ እዚ ዝመሓላለፍኩም ዘሎ በቶም ሶሊዳሪቲ ዝበሃሉ ጽኑሕ ሓደ ግዜ ተጸበይኒ ናፍቲ ኖርማል ክስታይና ክንመለስ ኢና ኦኬ ኣለኹም ኢለ ይግምት ትከታተሉ ወለኹም ኢኹም እሞ ሎማዓንቱ እዚ ሱቂልና እቲ ሕዚ መወዳእታ ዝዛረብ ዝነበረ ሓውና ሙሉ ሰንደቕ እዩ ሙሉ ሰንደቕ ትግራዋ ይወዳዕድና እዩ ንሱ እዩ ከተመሓላልፈዎ ወለኩም ትግራይ ኦንላይን መሓላልፈዎ ዋላ ናትኩም ንዓምነት ናተይ ብውልቀይ ኣነ ከመረኣያ ፌደራሊዝም ኢትዮጵያ ክሰርሕ እዩ ንተጋሩ ክሰርሕ እዩ ዝብል እምነት የብለይን እቲ ተጀሚሩ ዝነበረ ቀዳማይ ሚኒስተር መለስ ዜናዊ ብሂወት እናሃለወ ዝተወሰነ ሂንቲ ነይሩ ክሰርሕ ደኾን ይኸውን ዝብል ተስፋ ነይሩና እቲ ተስፋ ንሱ ኣይሰርሐን ድሕሪ ዝክሰርሕ ዝብል እምነት ይብለይን ግን ሙሉእ ብሙሉእ ሓሳባት ናይ ደቂ ሰባት ከም ነፃ ሚድያ ኣይነ ቁርቦን እዚ ኣነ ስለዚ ኣምነሉ ክብል ኣይክእልን እዚ ሶሊዳሪቲ ዝበሃሉ ብዙሓት ቅማንት ኣገው ዓፋር በነሻንጉል ሶማሊ ኦሮሞ ተጋሩ ዘለዎ ውደባ እዩ ነቲ ስርዓት ናይ ብልጽግና ዝቃወም ውደባ እዩ እቲ ቀደም ዝነበረ ፌደራሊዝም ተመሊሱ ክመጽእን ክዕንብብን ይኽእል እዩ ዝብል ተስፋ ኣለዎም እንተኮይኑሎም ይስርሕዎ ጸገም የብልና ነቲ ሕዚ ዘሎ ፋሽስታዊ ስርዓት ከውድቕን ከግልስን ዝኽእል ኩነታት እንድሕር ዝፈጥረሉ እዮም ድማ ዝበለጸ ንዝተወሰነ መንገዲ ብሓደ ክንከይድ ንኽእል ኢና ብናተይ ረኣያ እዩ ዝብለኩም ዘለኹ እዚ ክሳዕ ዝተወሰነ ኸይድና ድሕሪኡ ነናይ ባዕልና መንገዲ ንሕዝ ብናተይ ረኣያ ንተጋሩ ዘዋፀና ናይ ባዕልና ሃገር መንግስት መስርትና ናይ ባዕልና ሃገር ትግራይ ምምስራት ጥራሕ ይዘዋፀና ዝብል እምነት ይዘለኒ ንኹሉ ክንድተኸታተልኩም ሓደ 200 ገለን ዝኸውን ሰብ ይከታተል ጸኒሑ እዩ ከምዚ ዝበሉ ሓደ ፕሮግራማት ብፍላይ እቶም ፕሮፌሰራት ፕሮፌሰር ገላውዲየስ ኣርኣያ ዘቕርቦ ዝነበረ እቶም ክልተ ኣሜሪካውያን ፕሮፌሰርስ ዘቕርብዎ ዝነበሩ እውን ከም ተመክሮ ምስምዑ ጽቡቕ እዩ ዝጎድእ ነገር ኣይብሉን ሰሚዕኻ ምስናትና ምስ ህልው ኩነታትና እናተሓዝና ክንወስዶም እንታይ እየ ኣቕሪበልኩም ናፍቲ ስሩዕ መደብና ክንምለሲና ግን በዚ ቀጥታ ኣይንቕጽልን በዚ ሕዚ ዘለኹምዎ ኣይንቕጽሎን ዕረፍቲ ክንወስድ ኢና ሙሉእ ብሙሉእ ክወፅየ ካሊእ ሓዱሽ ላይቭ ፕሮግራም ድሕሪ 20 ደቂቓ 25 ደቂቓ ተመሊሰ ክመጽየ እንቱም ኣብዚ ዘለኹም ተመሊስኩም ድሕሪ 25 ደቂቓ ተመሊስኩም ምጽኢኹም ስሩዕ መደብ ናይ ሎማዓንቲ ናይ ትግራይ ኦንላይን ክጅምር እዩ ከምቲ ናይ ወትሩ ሓደ ሰዓት ኣይንገብሮን ስኢልና ህልው ኩነታት ናይ ከባቢና ናይ ትግራይ ናይ ኢትዮጵያ ናይ ዞባና ናይ ዞባ ቀርኒ ኣፍሪቃ እውን ሓደ ሒዘዮ ዘለኹ ሓበሬታታት ካፍለኩም እየ ከም ሓዱሽ እየ ተመሊሰ ከኣቱ እዚ ክንድምድሞ ኢና ምክንያቱ ሓደ ሰዓትን ፈረቓን ልዕሊ ሓደ ሰዓትን ፈረቓን ዝገበረ ፕሮግራም ነቲ ስሩዕ ፕሮግራምና ክቐብሮ ስለ ዝኾነ ብድሕሪት ዝኾነ ሰብ ይሪኦን ስለዚ ወፂና ኢና ክንመለስ ተመሊስኩም ምጽኢኹም ክንወፂና ሙሉእ ብሙሉእ ከም ሓዱሽ እየ ላይቭ ክገብሮ ከምቲ ኩሉ ሻዕ ዝነገረኩም ድማ እቲ ዩቱብ ሕጊ ኣለዎ ዘይረብሕ ሕጊ ሕማቕ ሕጊ ኢለ እየ ዝኣምነሉ ኣነ ኣብ ውሽጢ ሓፂር ግዜ እንድሕር ሓዱሽ መደብ ጀሚርካ ናብ ኖቲፊኬሽን ኣይልእኹን ምክንያቱ ዘዝቐደመ ልኢኽና ኢና ክንደይ ግዜ ክንርብሾ ነቲ ሰብ ዝብል justification እዩ ዘለዎም ስለዚ ንስኻትኩም ኣብዙ ዘለኹም ፈቃደኛታት ዝኾንኩም ናብቲ ስሩዕ መደብና ጽኒሕኩም ድሕሪ 25 10 ደቂቃ ተመለሱ ኢኹም ክንወፂና ነዚ መደብ እዚ ግን በዚ ክዛዘም እዩ ክንድስተኻታተልኩም ክብረት ይሃብለይ ይቕኒለይ ሓደ ነገር ተማሂርና ንኸውን ዝብል እምነት ኣለኒ እምበር ሙሉእ ብሙሉእ ኣነ ኣትየ ይመስለኩም ግን ነትኹም ዝብል ተፈለየ ሓሳብ ዘለዎ እውን ክነተኣናግዶ ኣለና ክነቕርቦ ኣለና ናይ ባዕልና መርገፅን ኣረኣያን ከም ዘሎ ኮይኑ ማለት እዩ ካብዚ ብዝተረፈ ጸኒሕ ክምለስ ድሕሪ 10 ደቂቃ ክምለስ ተመለስኩም ኣብዚ ኣኽንራኸብ ኢና ብድሓን ተመለሱ